This is Callie Holmes. I'm here interviewing Martha Zoller on January 10th, 2013 in Athens, Georgia, as part of the Richard B. Russell Library Oral History documentary series. And this is the second time we've had Martha here to interview. So to get started, I kind of wanted to get you to talk a little bit more about your parents' backgrounds. I know you were born in Columbus in 1959. So what can you tell me about your parents?
Yeah, my dad, Frank Mitchell, was born in Jersey City, New Jersey. He was the son of a German immigrant mother and a second-generation Scotch-Irish, which is kind of the I think what everybody calls themselves in America, Scotch-Irish. His dad owned a butcher shop, so from an early age, my father worked in the butcher shop. He was born in 1910. I was kind of an oops baby. He was 50 years old, or almost 50 years old when I was born. So he was born in 1910. So he had a kind of perspective of living through World War I, as well as fighting in World War II. My dad was a POW in World War II, and my parents met at Fort Jackson in 1942 before he was shipped out. He had been sent to Fort Jackson before he was shipped out. My mother was from Lexington, South Carolina, and my parents met at some sort of a dance that they were having for the guys, and she was one of the local girls that came to the dance, and so they met there and they dated for about a year, and my mother was a basketball player and was Miss Lexington County for 2 years in a row, and it's hard to imagine because my father did not finish high school and my mother finished high school, but in those days it was 11th grade. But you think about the level of education they had. They were very knowledgeable about the world. They loved the arts, all of that sort of thing. And so they met up at Fort Jackson and dated for about a year. And then he got his orders that he was going to be shipped out. And so they did what a lot of couples did at that time. They got married. And she was 19 and he was 31 at the time they got married. And I remember asking my mother, long after my father passed away, when was it that you figured out that there was such an age difference? And she goes, I'm pretty sure we were engaged because she was pretending to be older, he was pretending to be younger, and they just didn't talk about age the way I guess we do today. But they got married in June of 1942. In September of 1942, my dad was shipped out, and in September of 1944, he was captured in Montreal, France. He was part of the Liberation of France movement, and there was a battle there right around the first week of September. I think it began around the 16th of August, and they were moving through France. They had liberated Montreal, France right around the 1st of September, and he was captured right around that time, and he was reported as missing in action first, and then a POW. And then about 8 or 9 months later, he and 3 other guys escaped from the prison camp. And I recently have discovered an oral history at Rutgers University of one of the last remaining man from this group that's still alive. His name's Eddie Leonard, who told the story of their escape and said something. My maiden name was Mitchell, and said, we don't know how Mitch got a pair of wire cutters, but somehow he did. And then they got out. So I was able to find out those stories my dad had been telling me all those years were really true, which was really nice. And of the 4 guys, Eddie Leonard is the one that's still alive, but I will tell you, every New Year's Eve or Christmas Eve, when the phone would ring, it would always be one of those guys. And my dad died in 1991, and until my mother died in 2010, those guys, their wives, their families, all stayed in contact with each other. There was this camaraderie that you have, and even now in my run for Congress, Eddie Leonard gave me a little money. Jimmy O'Brien's kids gave me a little money for my campaign, my run for Congress. So there was this camaraderie that they had. My dad was a salesman. He came back from the war and he took a few marketing classes at NYU through the GI Bill, and they did what every other family at that time was doing. They started building a family. And so my siblings were all born in New Jersey, okay? They were born in Jersey City, and actually my one sister was born in upstate New York. My dad had been transferred to different places. And then in 1955, my parents were transferred to Columbus, Georgia, and in 59 I was born. And finally we were transferred to Washington, D.C. for a period of time in the early 60s. My dad then was transferred to Atlanta in 1964, and he said, don't transfer me anymore. So I got to grow up basically in the metro Atlanta area, went to high school there as well as elementary school, and then ultimately ended up at the University of Georgia.
And did your mother work, or did she stay home?
Yeah, my mom worked while my dad was away at the war, and it was funny because when he left, she was this 19-year-old kid that needed him for everything, and then when he came back, she had been working on her own for 3.5 years and had grown up, and that was some difficulty for them for a period of time. But she worked until my brother was born, who was their second child, and then she stayed home until I was 6 years old. She went back to work when I was 6, went to work as a salesperson at Rich's, which is now Macy's, and worked her way up to a buying position and then in a management position. So built a career for herself from, I guess she was roughly 41, 42 years old when she went back to work, and worked until she was 69. So she built a career for herself. She was always very guilty about going back to work because she felt like, that maybe I had suffered or whatever, but I think I got the best of both worlds, that I got that time with her at home, and then she worked, and I was always first to her. She always made sure she had time for me, but was funny, I just think it was I was so proud of her because, it wasn't easy to go back to work and manage the family, and my dad was still traveling and doing that sort of thing, so, it was great. She did a great job.
And did she ever give you advice about that kind of stuff when you were making decisions about your career and your family?
She said always put your family first, and that if you have to work, that's fine. And Mom actually went back to work so that she could pay for all of us to go to college. That's how my parents paid for us to go to college. She didn't believe in all the forms you had to fill out for student loans. She felt like the government didn't need to know personal information about you. And so she went back to work so she could do that. But she said, and this is not original to her, but the saying that, no one gets to their deathbed saying they wish they worked more, but a lot of people get to their deathbed and wish they had spent more time with their family, so not to forget that. And I tried to follow that rule in my own life. I didn't go back to work. I stayed at home with my children until my daughter was 6 years old, kind of similar to my mom, and then went back to work very part-time, and then built that up from there.
And do you remember your parents being involved in politics at all when you were growing up?
I did. My mom, not so much politics, but school and the PTA, and they certainly talked about politics all the time. We, were a traditional family in that we had the dinner table, and I was the youngest of 4 children, and I was always trying to have something to say. So I read a lot, and I think that's where my love of reading came, because I had teenage brothers and sisters when I was a fairly young child. And so the discussion was always about, the main discussions I remember is about the Vietnam War. My dad being a POW from World War II, the good war, and my brother arguing with him about, we shouldn't be in Vietnam, and that kind of discussion going back and forth. But I would always, it was funny because I would always spout off something I had read, and I was probably 7, 8, 9 years old. And I remember my brother saying to me, don't you have a thought of your own? Do you just spout off everything you read? And it really made me think about it. It's important to read, it's important to understand, but it's also important to decipher and figure out what you believe for yourself. So yes, it was political, but one thing I remember that predated me, that was a story told in my family, is that after Brown versus Board of Education was passed, my parents lived in Columbus, Georgia then, and my mom was president of the PTA at their school, and my mom said, well, if we've got to integrate the schools, why don't we start with kindergarten, and then the next year do kindergarten and first grade, and the next year like that, and do it gradually. And that was just a shocking thing. And she would say it was like we were going to get run out of town on a rail. That isn't what happened, but it was something that was still pretty raw that kind of thing. But as you look back on it, it took until 1972 for Georgia schools to be desegregated. And so really a plan like that would have worked and might have worked a little better than what we ultimately did.
So your mom had more of a liberal attitude towards integration than
the average person, yeah. I mean, we were always taught to believe that everybody was equal. We did have help in the house. You know, a lot of Southern families did. We had a maid for as long as I can remember. But we always, of course, paid her and took care of all of that. But my parents, I think it came from my mother living in South Carolina, where my grandfather worked for the telephone company, and he had a lot of black workers that worked under him. And so there was kind of a respect, and also, especially in certain parts of the South, because of the Depression, everybody was poor, and so it sort of was a leveler of everybody being poor, and so you had to sort of depend upon each other. My parents were never wealthy, and my mother was certainly never wealthy, but they had a real sense of what I view as a Christian sense about people, that everybody was equal and deserved a fair shot.
And so you had mentioned before that you were in high school, in Columbia High School, when it was desegregated. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we were known as Racially Disturbed Columbia High School. Jocelyn Dorsey, who is still at WSB at the time of this interview, was the reporter that was sent out to cover our high school. And we laugh about that now because we work for the same company, and I've bumped into her in the elevator and we talk about this, and we don't like to remember how many years we've known each other. But I was on the student council at the time because I've always been the kind of person that if something's going to be a controversy, I want to work on it from the inside. Okay, I'm a firm believer in that. And I don't know where I got that from. I'm sure I got it from my parents, but I'm a person that likes to work from the inside on things. And so I was on the student council, and there had been a plan for a walkout of the black students after the integration. And here's what I have to say about that. And again, this is my perspective as being a 14, 15-year-old student. I thought we were getting along fine. Yes, when you walked into the lunchroom, black kids were sitting together and white kids were sitting together, but I would argue that when you walk into any lunchroom, you kind of sit with the kids you already know instead of sitting with kids, especially at that age, that middle school and high school age. You're not really, you're kind of liking the clique at that point in time. But we got along fine. There weren't any problems, but there were some outside folks that got involved and wanted to make an example, I think, of Columbia High School because we were the newest high school in the county, in DeKalb County at that time. And so we had a walkout that I don't recall if it disintegrated into a riot or not at this point in time.
So the white students were walking out?
No, the black students walked out because they were saying that they weren't going to be treated fairly. And we, our student council, which was black and white students, we got together, and it's so funny now looking back on it, we made a bunch of these buttons with construction paper with sayings you would expect from the 70s, like keep your head, be cool, you know, that kind of thing. And we gave them out to every student because we didn't want to be the high school that they came and covered every day because there was trouble there. But I learned a lot from that. I mean, and there were silly things like we had to have a black band and a white band at our prom, and we had a black lead and a white lead in the play because they wanted to be sure everything was equal. But which seems a little silly when you look back on it now, but it was an important time, I think, in our history in DeKalb County, especially, and in Atlanta. And it was disappointing to me to hear recently that DeKalb County is on probation as far as their accreditation, because it was one of the best school systems in the country, and I think it can be again.
What did your parents say when all of this was going on?
They wanted to, initially they said, Martha, if you want us to pull you out of this high school and send you to St. Pius, if it's too difficult, we will do that. I mean, my parents weren't wealthy, but they said, if this is too hard for you, but we're staying in this neighborhood because this is our home, and we think you should go to that school. And because they felt they're kind of a stand and fight kind of people. We own this school. I mean, we own this house. This is our public school here. We shouldn't run away from it. Now, I will tell you, leading up to that, when I was 13 years old, our neighborhood was targeted for something they called blockbusting back in the day. And there was a company, a black-owned real estate company, that showed up at my door one day. I was 13 years old. I guess I was a latchkey kid. We didn't know what we called it then, but I was 13 years old. I opened the door, and there was this man standing there saying, "Do you know there's a black family living down the street from you? Don't you want to sell your house?" And I'm 13, I don't know what to say, and I took the man's card and I told my dad about it when he got home, and my father called him up and said, you know, we're not selling our house. This is our home, we're not going to sell the house. Now, what did ultimately happen, and it happened in a lot of neighborhoods in South DeKalb County, you know, probably there were 30 houses that went up for sale. And I've always argued, people say the values went down because the neighborhoods got integrated. That's not why the values went down. The values went down because of supply and demand. There were a whole lot more houses for sale than there were people to buy the houses. And that's why the prices go down. But we stayed in that neighborhood until 1994, until my mom retired and moved in with my brother. And, you know, I'm glad that we did. And in fact, in many ways, the neighborhood was more stable after it was an integrated neighborhood than when it was an all-white neighborhood, because when it was an all-white neighborhood, it was a very transitional neighborhood. It was a step up. People came in, lived for a couple of years, and then moved somewhere else. Once the neighborhood kind of integrated a little bit, the people stayed, and we had neighbors for, you know, for years and years.
Do you remember there being pressure from other white families for y'all to sell your house and move out, or?
No, just continuing having real estate agents saying, hey, we got somebody that wants to look at your house, that kind of thing. And my parents were just adamant that they weren't going to sell. That they didn't want to sell. I mean, you know, this was their home.
Yeah. And so I remember you saying you graduated high school a little bit early and decided to come to the University of Georgia.
I did.
How did you decide to come here?
Well, I think instead of, you know, I didn't want to change schools because there was a little bit of turmoil. So I thought, well, they had offered this opportunity to graduate early. All I needed was a couple of classes to graduate. So I went to summer school, and I came to the University of Georgia at 17 years old. I had just turned 17. I lived in Myers Hall. I went to the University of Georgia not only because my sister had gone there and I wanted to, but my parents weren't going to let me go anywhere much farther away, being only 17. So I lived in Myers Hall, and a funny story about that is it was the only co-ed dorm at the time in 1976, and when I started, and it was also the dorm my sister had lived in 1965, 66, and it wasn't co-ed at the time, and I don't even know if that's a term that people know anymore, of dorm being co-ed. I mean, that was a big term at the time, but it meant that boys and girls both lived in the dorm, and I didn't tell my parents it was co-ed. When I filled out the form, I just said, oh, I'm going to put down Myers Hall. And, oh, good, Pam lived there, so you can live there too. So I got to live in Myers Hall, which was the co-ed dorm, and I actually met my husband there, so it was good.
And what was it like being at Athens and the University of Georgia in that time period, in the mid-70s?
It was great. It was a quarter system at the time, and so that meant that football started actually before classes started. And I remember my first game was Alabama, Georgia, and Bear Bryant was the coach, and we actually beat Alabama 21-0 at Sanford Stadium. And I can remember walking down Lumpkin Street back up to Myers Hall, and I called it parties breaking out. I mean, I'd never seen anything like this before. You had these frat houses, and all these parties were starting because we had beaten Alabama, and I probably would be like that today too. And I remember thinking it was really a lot of fun, but I had to learn very quickly. The drinking age was 18 at the time, and I had to learn very quickly that you've got to balance, you know, your study time with your play time. And my first quarter at Georgia, I didn't do very well. I think I made a 2.3 or 2.4, something like that. And I can remember coming home at Christmas break, and my dad sitting there in his chair in the living room with my grades in his hand, because the grades were mailed to your parents at that point in time because they were paying the bills. And he just looked at me. He didn't yell at me or anything like that. He just said, if this is as good as you can do, you can come home and go to Georgia State. and I made Dean's List every other quarter, and except for my last one. I think I made a 2.8 or 2.9 my last quarter because I was ready to be out of here. But it was, and I don't know why I was ready to be out of here, because it was really a great time. I mean, I had exempted a bunch of hours when I got here. I started early and I had exempted a number of hours, and so I really finished college in 3 years and a quarter. And I always tell people I have no regrets about my life, but the one thing I would do differently is I would have gone straight to graduate school, because I was young anyway. I was 20 years old, and I could have gotten graduate school under my belt and gotten it out of there. But I wanted to get to work for some reason, and I got out there, and I've had a great life since then. But someday I'll get back to graduate school.
And what was it? Do you remember what the atmosphere was like politically here around that time?
It was the time of the unknown candidate. Remember, I don't know if you remember that thing, but there was a guy that ran for student council president, and he was the unknown candidate. He ran as the unknown candidate, and it was some kind of candidate from a show, if I recall. And so when he was elected, he abolished student government. So there was a couple of years that there was no student government as a result of that. He went on to work for CNN and that kind of thing. So it was kind of interesting. But politically, I think that there was. I don't know if this is political but I remember an article in the Red and Black about what the students were like, and it was titled Greeks, Freaks, and Dormies. That you were either in the Greek system, you were kind of a hippie, or you lived in the dorm. And I guess I was the girl that lived in the dorm because I loved living in the dorms. I did that the whole time. But politically, it wasn't a very political atmosphere. You were much more insulated then. You didn't really leave campus for much. There wasn't a lot of going downtown and partying and that kind of thing. That sort of thing. It was a little bit different because it was more like you went onto campus and you stayed onto campus all the time. And very few people lived off campus. That was a kind of a new concept. So you were kind of protected in this little world, which is in a way what college ought to be. I mean, it ought to be this protected academic world. But I wasn't that political in college.
And you were a journalism?
I was a journalism major. I started out as a voice major, and I did 1 quarter of voice major and did not do well in theory. And also realized that as a mezzo-soprano, I was never going to get the lead. And I had read a book by Dan Rather called The Camera Never Blinks. And I thought, that I'd be good at that. I would like to do that. And so I changed my major to what was called radio, TV, film. And I think that by the time I graduated, they called it telecommunications arts. I don't know what they call it now. And I really never intended to be on the talking side of the microphone. I was going to be on the production side and put it together and that sort of thing. But I loved the J School, and I loved being a part of that. So I changed my major and I minored in business.
So I know you said you met your husband when you were in Myers Hall, but did you get married right after college, or was that later?
No, it was later, actually, because we dated through college, and it was one of those unusual things where he wanted to get married and I didn't, and so I always jokingly like to say he went off and married the next girl he met, and 10 years later, after both of us had been married and divorced, we met up I was going to a family wedding, a family friend's wedding, and we met up again, and kind of the rest is history. We've been married 22 years, so.
Okay. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about how you've sort of developed the political ideas and viewpoints that you have now. I know in the interview we did with you in December, you talked a little bit about how you voted Democratic in the 70s. And I think you said something like, well, everybody voted Democratic at that time. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Sure. There really weren't Republicans running in Georgia. And my parents were Republicans. But, actually, my father was a Republican. I think my mother was a Democrat. But the idea was back then that you voted the way your husband did because you were going to cancel out his vote if you didn't. But I think my mother may have secretly voted Democrat but not told my dad about it. But she was an FDR Democrat type, and a lot of people in the South were because, in a lot of ways FDR was considered as being the person that saved us in the Depression. So there weren't really any Republicans, and I'll be honest with you, I have always been a fiscal conservative, but I thought I was more liberal socially as I was growing up. And I kind of bought into the sound bites about Republicans being against women. It's kind of funny that is still perpetuated today. So I got involved with candidates. I did actually work a phone bank for Gerald Ford in 1976, and I thought the people were really rude, and so I only did it one day, and so I did not vote for Ronald Reagan in 1980, and I didn't vote for him in '84 either. So I at the time I thought Ronald Reagan, and I said this in my book, I believed the hype about him. You know, I believed that he didn't like women, and he was bad on minority issues and all this kind of stuff, sort of the mainstream media view, although we didn't call it that. And then in 1986, after I had been working out in the world working and really focusing mostly on my career, not on politics. I was a buyer at Riches. I didn't have anything to do with journalism right out of school because the economy was worse than it is now. As far as unemployment rate was like 14% when I got out of school, and I got offered a job being a news director in Savannah, but it paid like $120 a week, and I just couldn't support myself on that. So I had worked for Riches throughout college, and they offered me a job in their executive training program, and so I took it because it was $10,500 a year, and I thought that was a lot of money. So I had been more focused on my building my career and that sort of thing. But I moved to Cobb County in the 1986, and I was flipping around C-SPAN because I am a C-SPAN geek, and had always liked watching policy. And I saw a speech with Newt Gingrich, and Newt Gingrich was my representative at that point in time. And I was going to flip right past it because I thought, I don't want to hear anything this guy has to say. And so I stopped. And he was he's a historian, and he was talking about history, and I love history, and I thought, wow, this guy really knows a little more than I thought he did. I wonder what else I've been wrong about. So I started reading and studying, and the convention, the Democratic Convention, was going to be in Atlanta in 1988. So I said, what better way, this goes back to me liking to work from the inside, what better way for me to find out if I'm a Democrat or not? I'm going to volunteer for a campaign, and I'm going to hopefully work for the convention. So I started reading up on the Democratic candidates, and I found Mike Dukakis. And Mike Dukakis was supposedly the Massachusetts miracle, and he was kind of a fiscal conservative, but he was very liberal socially. And I kind of thought that's where I was at that point in time. So, and he had an office in Atlanta that had already opened. So I went down and volunteered in that office, and I still have some friends that I made there today that were great. And I started volunteering in the office, and I had an American-made car. I had a Chrysler, which there was a big, American-made push back then. So because of that, I got to do a lot of really cool things. Like I got to drive Olympia Dukakis, the actress, around when she came to town, and I got to drive Sam Donaldson around when he came to town. And I remember Sam Donaldson said to me, "Why is a beautiful woman like you supporting a loser?" I said, well, you pick the person you support and you stay with them till the end. I got to drive the governors around, Governor Dukakis around. I got to meet with him on a couple of things. I was Kitty Dukakis' driver during the convention, so I drove her every day. And I remember her saying to me, "You've got to meet Michael," meaning Governor Dukakis. "You've got to tell him what you told me." And what it was she said, "Why is it Southerners don't like me, and like my husband?" And I said, "Well, because he's not very warm and fuzzy, and we like people that are a little more personal." "Oh, you need to come and tell Michael this." So I got to go to the airfield and sit down and talk with the governor, and so that was pretty cool, and I liked that. So I did vote for Mike Dukakis in 1988, and he lost. But while I was in that process, especially during the convention, what I saw was a very fragmented group of people that were anti-success, I felt, and were very much about groups of people. What's the black vote? What's the women's vote? What's this vote? What's that vote? And I just felt like it didn't fit me. And so I continued reading and that sort of thing, and became more and more conservative as time went on. And I think from a social standpoint, what changed me was when I got married and got pregnant, and I saw that grainy sonogram in 1991 of my daughter and the little heart beating. And that's when I realized that, life does begin at conception, and that I was pro-life. But where I've gotten in trouble, and we'll talk about the campaign later, but where I've gotten in trouble is that I am a little more reasonable about that position than a lot of people are, in that I don't necessarily think it should be illegal. There are rare instances where abortion should, is never a good option, but is the option that's on the table. And so I think we need to focus less on whether it's legal or not, and more about changing people's hearts and minds so that they can make better decisions about what they're going to do. What I hate is that over the last 45 years, however many years it's been since Roe v. Wade, we are sending women to abortion clinics because a lot of doctors, especially in states like ours, don't want to do abortions. They don't want to be associated with that. And so instead of having a doctor that knows you, counseling you on what your options are, you're going to an abortion clinic where they're not going to talk to you about adoption. They're not going to talk to you about what your other options are. They're going to just counsel you on getting an abortion. And I think we've done a real disservice to women because we have relegated them to taking them out of their doctor's office where they know somebody, where there might be, a private adoption done or something that would be a better outcome. I've spent a lot of time volunteering with women who have had abortions, and I have never met a woman who even if she went on finishing school, getting married, having other children, doing all that kind of stuff, that didn't regret the decision that she made. And I think we really, instead of uplifting women, which is the message that the left has, that this empowers women, I think we've relegated women to sending them to a place where they're not getting the best information about what's best for them. And that's really why I made the change.
So, sort of, since we're talking about women, I just wanted to ask, would you consider yourself a feminist?
Yes, because I believe women are equal. I believe that we ought to have equal opportunities, but I also think that we want things at different times. I have a little saying, which again is not unique to me, but you can have it all, just not at the same time. I never thought I would be a woman that would be happy staying at home with children. And once you have that baby in your arms for the first time, you cannot prepare yourself for how you're going to feel. It doesn't matter what you did throughout that 9 months of pregnancy. When that little baby gets put in your arms for the first time, at least my first thought was, and I said to my husband, we need to be sure now we don't hurt each other, because this little person is depending on us. And the second thing I thought is, I don't want to be away from these kids at all. I just want to be there for everything. Now, children want all of your time. They don't need all of your time. And there's nothing wrong with finding a balance. And that's what I did. When I married my husband, Lynn, he had 3 little boys that were 3, 5, and 7 that he had full custody of. And so after about 6 months of marriage, I realized they needed somebody at home full time. We had been through 3 nannies, and I say nannies in the loosest sense of the word, because it wasn't like we were paying these girls like $120 a week or $150 a week to come in and help, but it just wasn't working, because I was tired and cranky, and we looked at it, and at the time I was making about as much money as my husband was making, who's a primary care physician. He was just starting out, but I was kind of at the top of my pay scale, and his income was going to grow. So we said, okay, let's bite the bullet, and I decided to stay at home. So we cut our income in half one day, and it took us about 3 years to earn that money back. But I stayed home full time for 8 years, and I wouldn't trade those times for anything. It was difficult, but a lot of times it was fun. They needed somebody at home, and they needed to know that I wasn't going to go away for building my relationship with my stepchildren. And then I was having difficulty getting pregnant, and so working and doing all that kind of stuff. So I knew if I didn't loosen up my life a little bit, I wasn't going to get pregnant. Sure enough, about 9 months later, I got pregnant, and 9 months after that, we had Suzanne, and I stayed home until she was 6 years old. Now, when I went back to work, I'm always so thankful. I went back to work for WDUN, which was a local radio station, and it was my first time on radio, but I went very part-time until I had drivers. And then once I had drivers in the house, then I started expanding out, and now I work all the time because I'm a workaholic. But I'm glad that I did it that way, and I just think that, you know, this idea of working women versus non-working women, that's a whole creation of the 1950s and 60s, because prior to the 1950s, men didn't really get in their car and go to work. You worked on the farm or you worked in the local business, that kind of thing. This idea of getting in your car and going to work was a fairly World War II and post-World War II thing. And it created this thing where we started splitting women up between women who worked and women who didn't. Let me tell you something, all women work. Doesn't matter whether you stay at home with kids or you go out into the workplace, and we need to not separate ourselves from each other. We need to support each other.
Did you ever feel like people were judging the decisions you made about your career and your family?
Oh, absolutely. I got to tell you, when I was home, you do feel that sort of like when people say, well, what do you do? You know, and you've been used to being in the work world. I mean, I was kind of in the driving work world, and I was successful at it. And so you do feel that. And I think that's what kind of led to my anger about Hillary Clinton's "I could have stayed home and baked cookies" statement, because that's what prompted me to call into talk radio for the first time. And I really ought to thank her, because I wouldn't have the career I had if she hadn't said that and I hadn't picked up the phone, because I did a lot more than bake cookies. And it certainly wasn't easy. It was, in fact, the hardest job I've ever had, because you can't go anywhere to get away from it. You know, at least when you go to work, at some point in time, you say, okay, I got to go to work now. Let's go. You know, she made the statement, I could have stayed home and baked cookies. I called into the local radio station, and one thing led to another. They liked what I had to say, and they called me in for a segment and then a show, and I started doing talk radio, and you know, since then I've built a media career.
And so let's take a step back for a minute. How did you start listening to talk radio?
It was as I was driving around in my car with my kids, and I was becoming more conservative, and I flipped around and I found Rush Limbaugh. And you know, whether you like Rush Limbaugh or not, the guy is the best broadcaster that's out there. He hardly ever says or makes a mistake. He is, I think, entertaining and compelling. And you know, when I hear people say he's mean and nasty and all this kind of stuff, that's not what I hear. That's not what I hear when I'm listening. So I was driving around the car listening to Rush Limbaugh to start off with, and then started listening to other kinds of talk radio, and either before or after the show. So that's kind of how that happened.
And this was around the late 80s?
Late 89, 90, 91.
Mm-hmm. So you called in and then ended up sort of calling in more, and then getting sort of a part-time gig on the radio station. How do you think you became popular? What do you think appealed to people about what you had to say?
I think, first of all, I hadn't lived behind a microphone my whole life. I had driven the carpool, and I was a mother and a stepmother, and I think there's a heck of a lot of blended families out there. I think that I was able to have this ability to weave in what I was doing every day with the issues of the day. And I think that people liked, you know, it's something I can't get a grip on, because people say they like the sound of my voice. I hate the sound of my voice, and I think that's just the normal thing about listening to yourself. But people said that they liked listening to me, and then, you know, I think I reflected what a lot of people were thinking, and it wasn't in the box kind of thinking.
Were you apprehensive about making that move into talk radio?
Oh, very much so, because you're opening yourself up to being criticized, because let me tell you, callers think they know everything, and in a way they do. I mean, they are the consumers. But somebody told me something early in my talk radio career, is that callers are really less than 1% of the people that are out there listening to you. Okay, and so you can't totally tailor your show to the callers. You have to make sure you're reaching everybody else. So that was a good thing to say, because people will get very angry at you. I, in fact, have had on 2 occasions had to have police protection because of threats that were made against me over the last 15 years or so. One woman killed her in-laws, and I and the district attorney and a number of other people there were about 500 people on a list that she was going to go after, and I was one of those names. So you get that call, you know, saying, oh, we're going to be putting extra patrols around your house, and I would always say, because my in-laws have the same name as my husband, you know, I'd always say, well, they're in the phone book. We're not. You need to put some over there too. So we'll see that. And then one other instance where I was the National Alliance, which is just the Klan without masks. They didn't like me, and I kind of am proud of that. Okay, because they had my face on a big placard with a big X through it, and they were saying I was a race baiter. A race mixer is what they called me. I said, "What is this? The 1950s? We're calling yourself a race mixer." And I went out to my car one day in the parking lot, and there was a very graphic and awful video that had been put on my windshield. And so that knew two things. They knew what my car looked like, and they knew where I worked, okay? And so that was pretty scary. And I popped the video in, and I, of course, immediately called the GBI, and it was basically what they do to people who race mix is what it was. And it was those were the two instances where it was a little scary. The third thing, and when you're on talk radio, you're eventually going to have somebody threaten you, and you're eventually going to get mail from jail. That's just the way it is. But the third thing was, and I had always been very open about talking about my family on the radio, and I think that was something that people liked about me, but I realized I was talking too much about them because I get this letter from this guy threatening my daughter. And I still can remember opening up the letter, and as I'm reading it, my hand's starting to shake. And again, I immediately called the sheriff's department. They came and picked up the letter. The GBI took care of the guy immediately. He was already in jail, so they just moved him as far away from me as they could get him so that he couldn't hear me. But I hadn't realized that I would been talking about that it was my daughter's birthday coming up, and they took that. It was just, and it made you realize, gosh, am I putting my family in danger by the things that I'm saying or doing? And that's something I had to think about. And then I just quit talking about them in specific terms. Now they're all adults, so it doesn't matter, but I talked about them in more general terms. And so you realize you do adjust your behavior sometimes if you're scared. And so it's one of those things.
And do you think any of those threats and things, do you think any of that had to do with you being a woman?
Possibly, but I think it was more my positions. I am a person that will take a position, but also I will see other people's side on it, and sometimes people take that as being wishy-washy. I take that as, looking at things appropriately. And I don't think most people would say I'm wishy-washy, but a person that would go as far as threaten you probably has something else going on, and you just have to look at it that way.
And so what was talk radio like in the early 90s? What was going on, in Georgia with talk radio?
I think what was booming, which was great, was that I mentioned Rush Limbaugh, and Rush Limbaugh really saved AM radio, okay? Everybody was thinking AM radio was going to go the way of the dinosaur, and when Rush Limbaugh came along in the late 1980s, he created a fairly cheap platform because music had all moved over to FM. Now talk is moving over to FM, okay? But music had all moved over to FM, and so AM stations were kind of languishing. And so they've gone from not knowing what to do with AM stations to in the 90s, like the mid-90s, there was something like 4,500 conservative talk shows on AM radio. So it was a booming business, and there was a lot of people making money, or some people making money. I think the thing that people don't realize about radio is that there's only a few people that make a lot of money, and then everybody else does okay, but it's not something that everybody's getting rich off of, but it's something you do because you love it. Of course, Atlanta's an interesting market for talk radio, because Atlanta metro areas, because you've got Neil Bortz came out of the Atlanta market, Sean Hannity came out of the Atlanta market. There's a lot of Clark Howard came out of the Atlanta market. There's a lot of big names that have come out of the Atlanta market, and I think it's pretty exciting when you look at it. But I've enjoyed every minute of it, and it was volatile. It was people wanted you to be shocking, and I was never a shock jock. I was never one of those kind of people. In fact, recently after this last election, what they're finding from conservative listeners is that they don't want the nastiness anymore. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's perfect for me because I really like discussing issues. So we'll see what happens. Some people think I was nasty, but I don't think I was ever nasty.
And were there other women doing talk radio in that time?
I actually had a female partner with my first show. Her name was E.J. Gore. I was the first woman in Georgia. I don't want to say I was the first political woman in Georgia. I guess someone will come in and correct that. But there aren't many women. And I will tell you, when I go to industry meetings like the New Media Seminar or the National Association of Broadcasters Talk Radio Seminar, that's the only time I kind of feel negative where I may not make it, because everybody that makes the decisions are men, and the big names in talk radio are men, and women that are in there kind of have to act like men and talk like men, and but I am a very optimistic person, so I only let that get me down for a little bit, and then I think, look, people like my personality, people like my point of view, and as long as they do, I'll keep doing what I'm doing. But the great thing is I'm not defined by what I do. I'm defined by my family and my relationships. So if God has another plan for me down the road, then I'll do something else.
Did you feel like your coworkers were accepting of you when you first started?
Yeah, they want to see that you're going to actually do the work, though, because radio, like retail, restaurant work, those kinds of things that are 24/7 kind of work, everybody works hard. And so when a new person comes in, they want to be sure that that person's going to work as hard as they do. And that's what they wait and see first. Now, and what's so different, too, when I first started talk radio, we clipped articles out of newspapers. Okay, I mean, you'd have a stack of articles that you had been clipped out of or torn out of newspapers. Then I remember I was one of the first people I knew that had a laptop computer where you could go on this thing called the internet and look things up. Wow, you can really look things up. This was even before Google, okay? And there wasn't a lot of stuff on the internet, but you could at least get some newspapers. The New York Times has actually been the best, even though they've been frenetic about whether they charge for it or give it to you for free. They go back and forth. They actually, because they have such a massive archive, they're really a great source of information, even though I know a lot of conservatives, make fun of the New York Times. If you really need to go back and find out some information about something, that's the place to go. So I would go to the New York Times a lot and that kind of thing. But now, of course, I print out very little. When I do my show every day, basically it's links that I click on, or I've made a few notes or something like that. But you're saving a lot of trees these days than compared to what you did 15 years ago.
And after you started getting into talk radio, what kind of opportunities opened up?
Well, I started doing a public affairs television show called the Brunel News Forum, which was at Brunel University. And then through that, I started doing the Georgia Gang, which was a television show that's been on forever. I did that for 10 years. And then I also started writing columns. And I started doing television hits on, World News Tonight, Fox News Channel, MSNBC, basically anybody who asked. And if it was a reasonable point in time, I even did German television for the 2004 election. Because I did this calendar called Babes for Bush in 2004, because there had been a calendar of Babes Against Bush, and so I agreed to do a calendar, just a headshot. It was just a headshot, nothing racy. But because I did that calendar, German TV, ARD, asked me to be on, and what was so funny about that was they told me it was the English version of German TV. I speak a little German, but I really don't speak a lot of German. And it turned out it was all in German, and I had an earpiece where they were translating in my ear as I was getting asked questions. So I don't know what I looked like. I hope there's no video of that out there, but you got to do very interesting things. So,
and tell me more about the Georgia Gang. Who were you working with when you were doing that?
Well, I tell you, that's an interesting story, because I was looking for a local television show that paid, that I could do, because you can do a lot of free work in media, but I wanted to be paid. So I had been watching, somebody says, oh, you need to get on the Georgia Gang, you need to call Dick Williams. And so I called Dick Williams up and I said, look, you call yourself the Georgia Gang and you got a bunch of Atlanta writers on there and nobody from anywhere outside the perimeter. I'd love to be on the show. Well, he wasn't sure about it, and then he started listening to me, and I cleared my calendar on Fridays, and my strategy was he'd eventually need somebody to fill in at the last minute, and I would come in and do a great job at that, and then he'd have me on all the time, and that's basically what happened. And for about 10 years, I was on just about every week, around 42 times a year, and it was great. And the power of television is just amazing, because even though I've been off since I ran for Congress, a couple of months before I ran for Congress, I had to stop doing the Georgia Gang. And so I haven't been on for 2.5 years, something like that. And I still have people come up to me and say, I watch you every week. I watch you every week on the Georgia Gang. And it's that power of television that for such a long period of time, I was in their home every Sunday morning, or just about every Sunday morning. So when they see me, they think, oh, I watch you every week. So television is still extremely, extremely powerful. And I loved doing the Georgia Gang. It opened up a lot of doors for me in a lot of other ways. I will always be thankful to Dick Williams and Bill Shipp, and the other folks that are on the show. A couple of years ago, they had some budget cutbacks, and so they went down to 4 people. And so they thought they were doing me a favor by letting me go, and I think in a lot of ways that they did. I will always love the time I had on the Georgia Gang, though.
And what do you think your viewpoint was that you were bringing to the table of the Georgia Gang?
I think it was first of all, a working journalist, somebody that was on the air every day talking to listeners, hearing what people had to say, so a little bit closer to the average person, and then conservative, female, and this transition. And you got to understand that when I started in June of 2000 and went through about early 2011, that when I started, Democrats still controlled everything in Georgia, and then by the time I ended, Republicans controlled everything. So I was a good voice on that transition.
Do you remember some of the issues that came up when y'all were doing the Georgia Gang? Any kind of notable experiences while you were doing that?
Well, I tell you, one interesting time was that when they had the courthouse shooter, that was on a Friday, and it was March 11th, and we were supposed to be taping, but because it was live, this was happening, and they were chasing this guy all over Atlanta, Brian Nichols. We sat there in the studio for about 8 hours waiting to do the show, which I thought was kind of an interesting, memorable moment. Anytime we talked about water issues was always good, and there were a lot of moments. Winners and losers were a lot of fun, which was at the end where you tried to kind of rile things up a little bit. But there were a lot of memorable moments.
Do you think has been anything else going on in Georgia that's presented that same type of panel of viewpoints?
The lawmakers does that. Certainly, it's something that I've thought about doing here at the University of Georgia, and we hope that we'll be able to put something like that together. I think you need that kind of discussion of issues. It was modeled after the Capitol Gang, which I think is a show that's still in play. So yeah, I think you always need that kind of panel discussion that goes on, and I hope that there'll continue to be a lot of it.
And so through doing the talk radio and the Georgia Gang, you have to talk a lot. And how has that helped you shape your viewpoints about political issues?
Well, not only have I gotten to talk a lot, but I've gotten to interview a lot of really interesting people, okay? And so I've got to talk to the best experts in just about any issue you can imagine. As well as elected officials from all across the spectrum, from John Lewis to, Tom Price and everybody in between, our senators. I've talked to Johnny Isakson as this, as a candidate for governor. I've talked to him as a candidate for state rep. I've talked to him as the chairman of the board of education for Georgia. In every phase of his life, I've talked to him, so I've learned a lot from him. I've seen a lot of people over the years. So I think what I did was I learned a lot. I think you have to be a lifelong learner. For somebody to say, this is my position and I will never change it. And there are certainly core values that you don't want to change. But if you learn something new, then you ought to change your point of view. If we are so rigid that we can't admit that we've learned something new, we've got a lot of, that's not going to work. So I like to think of myself as a lifelong learner, and that I've learned a lot, and I love talking to people. I love reading. I love listening to people, and I have always loved to read. So being able to interview authors of books that I have loved has been fantastic.
And what do you think the effect of having internet and satellite radio so prevalent, has that had an effect on talk radio, do you think?
It has, but we thought initially it was going to be a negative to it. But what it really has done is it has saved radio. And what I mean by that is, while maybe people are going to not have radios in their cars someday, but they're going to have their smartphones connected up, or whatever the device is of the future. And what we've found in the last few years is that by being able to hear a radio show on an app on your phone or something like that, gives it kind of a new life. And newspapers especially, while I'm not a newspaper person necessarily, 3 years ago, I work for Cox Media Group, we thought newspapers were going to be dead. And now with the advent of the iPad especially, but the tablets, newspapers have found a new market. So people are always going to want to get their local news, and the reason why I think radio is not going to die, maybe it's going to change forms, and people talk about terrestrial radio or stick radio versus satellite and internet radio. It's all going to mix in together. I mean, I'm on a lot of platforms, for example. I'm back at work on radio. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I have a link on marthazoller.com to listen live to my show. I mean, so there's a lot of different cross-pollinating of these different ways of getting information. That can be bad because there's so much information out there, but it also can be good. And I liken it back to, 100 years ago, there was a newspaper for everything you could imagine. Now there's some kind of audio or video for everything you can imagine.
So what do you think are the most important news sources for those interested in Georgia politics today?
Well, what I like to do, first of all, you can sign up for anything you're interested in, and I log on to my email every morning, and I've got all kinds of things in there. But what I go to first, I go to the AJC's Political Insider, Jim Galloway first. I go to Peach Pundit and see what's going on there. I have some, Google News alerts on certain topics relating to Georgia politics, and just those get pulled from multiple different sources. I'm working on developing some sources, that are going to be more of a go-to place for Georgia politics, and because I do think there is a void of elected officials being able to get their message out. There's all this noise and all this information, but still people don't know how to get their message out. So we've got to work on that. But the three things I go to first is the Political Insider, Peach Pundit. And then I do go to Drudge Report, because I got to tell you, even though that's not Georgia politics, he has got his finger on the pulse of what the big stories are going to be. I mean, he's not 100% of the time right, but generally, if it shows up on Drudge Report, it's going to be something people are going to talk about. And then, of course, I work my own sources. I mean, I'm an old-fashioned person, because you don't want to just sound like you're pulling things off of an internet site and reading it. I mean, you've got to have your own thing. So there's about 10 phone calls I make, phone calls or emails that I give, or text messages about every couple of days. There's about 10 or 12 people that I try to touch base with and get. You want to get some information first. I mean, that's what this business is about. So, I have a group of people that are kind of, my sources.
What impact do you think talk radio has on politics in Georgia?
I think that what talk radio has done is balanced out the voice. People criticize the fact that it's all conservative or mostly conservative. I mean, gosh knows, Air America tried to make it. I mean, there was a guy here in Georgia that was behind it. It didn't make it. There's been numerous tries at trying to get liberal talk off the ground. My theory about that, and my friend Alan Combs, who is one of the few successful liberal talkers, okay, so he and I agree on this. One of the few things we agree on is that liberal talkers don't have a sense of humor. They don't know how to make a joke. And number two, when you're bashing business all the time, it's kind of hard to get advertisers. If you're always talking about the big oil, big this, big that, the corporate problems, this is still a business that has to sell advertising to be able to stay on the air. And if you're bashing the people that might potentially advertise with you, you're not going to be able to get advertisers. So I think conservative radio is a balance, and it's part of the blogosphere and some other things that are more conservative in nature, but it's the balance to the more liberal traditional media. And all you got to do is look at the numbers. People say, Oh, you're wrong about the media. Most of the people in media today that are in the so-called mainstream media, whether it's in Georgia and other places, give to Democratic causes and vote Democratic according to their own numbers. So it's a balance. I see it as a balance out to what the message is. But we've got to be sure we're accurate. We can't do the same thing the other side does and only slant things our way. I'm an equal opportunity criticizer. If someone that's a conservative does something wrong, I will comment on that. If I don't like a conservative policy, I will comment on that. I think that you have to guard your integrity. And if you're just known as a person that's just going to lash out at liberals no matter what, people aren't going to take you seriously.
And so one thing we talked a little bit about last time was your campaign last fall. How did you make the decision to run for office?
I felt like a couple of things. My children were grown, and so I had the time to do it. It was something I'd always wanted to do. I'd always wanted to serve. And there was a new seat in the district, so it was an open seat. And I felt like it was the right time for me to be able to run. And so I talked to my husband about it. He was behind it, talked to my children about it. And we decided to make the plunge. And I announced September 7th, 2011. And I was defeated in the runoff on August 21st, 2012. So it was about a year of campaigning every day. And I tell you, it's hard work. I am a hard worker, but it is really hard work because it was a huge district, 20 counties, a lot of meetings, a lot of people. And but I wouldn't trade a minute of it.
And can you talk a little bit about the endorsements that you were able to get for your campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I had Sarah Palin endorsed me, Rick Santorum endorsed me, Newt Gingrich, Herman Cain, Susan B. Anthony List, Georgia Right to Life, Citizens United, which are known for the Supreme Court decision. And so I had a long list of very good conservative endorsements.
Did you find that it was hard to do fundraising for your campaign?
Money was the biggest difficulty we had in our campaign. We never had more than $50,000 on hand at any given time. We did end up raising, I think, around $350,000 totally, but $70,000 of that was after the runoff to retire my campaign debt. We raised close to $100,000 in the runoff, the 3-week runoff period, because I came within 700 votes of winning in the primary. People were splitting hedging their bets and probably giving to both of us, both me and Representative Collins. I think that was the hardest part of it, but it was the thing I got the best at as time went on. And I think that if I ever do this again, I will be much better at it, because you cannot replace the getting on the phone and making the ask yourself. Okay, and that is something that's really important. It's still a real personal business. If somebody's going to give you their money, they want you to call them and ask for it and be nice about it. I think that the biggest challenge is that, I just would say this to anybody that's out there thinking about supporting a candidate. If you're not going to support them, just tell them you're not going to support them, and then they won't call you again, okay? And it'll be something there. But I think the toughest part about campaigning is raising money. And that's what I'm going to take in whatever I do. But what I found now is that the fundraising skills that I've developed is helping me in the new projects that I'm working on. So that's good.
And how did you negotiate sort of asking people for money versus not being bought by people, as they say?
Yeah, I think you'd have to give somebody a lot of money to buy them, okay? I laughingly say it better be retirement money if I'm going to be bought, all right? But, the limits are pretty clear on federal money. You can't give more than $2,500 for an individual, and you can't take money from companies. But there's ways to get around it. There's bundling. I mean, law firms are notorious for bundling, all of their employees together and all of that kind of stuff, so you can get a lot of money out of one thing. I didn't have that problem. I had a couple of PACs that gave me money, the $5,000, because PACs can give $5,000. I had a few people that gave the $2,500 every time they could give it to me. But I think the key is, I had somebody ask me I after I lost the election, I did some grassroots work for the governor, and somebody questioned me, well, aren't you being bought by the governor? And I said, well, did the money you gave me in my campaign buy me? No, it didn't. I mean, I don't think money's going to do that. I think if it's a lot of money, I guess it could. But I really believe that it's about how you set it up. And I didn't really say, if you give me this money, I'll do this for you. Okay, and in fact, I shied away from people who said, well, I really expect you to do X, Y, and Z if I give you this money. And I didn't have to return any. I think I returned a couple of contributions because I didn't align up with what the people thought. But it is, it's not something I had to do a lot of.
And so, what do you think is different about being a woman in politics?
Well, I think the more difficult thing is women do a lot of volunteer work, so they are not able to have the network of people that give money as much. The Tea Party, which I am very proud to be a part of the Tea Party, they haven't learned how to give money yet, and that's one thing they're learning to do. That if you're going to have Tea Party type candidates, then you got to learn how to give money. I think that one of the challenges that you have is you don't have the good old boy network. There aren't that many women in power, and how you develop the good old boy network or the power network, and I hope that we'll be changing the name of that soon to the power network. How you get that is by being in power for a while. Well, there aren't that many women that have been in elected office for that long that can develop that kind of tit for tat. One thing I learned that I did underestimate is that there was pretty much this kind of, my opponent, Doug Collins, was a state representative. So basically that created a pool of money from people that would help him because he was a state representative, and he was part of that club of being a state representative. So he was able to come out of the box. Our first reporting period, he had 114,000 and I had 29,000. Okay, and we were able to keep that gap pretty much of 100,000. I mean, we matched him every other quarter fundraising. It was just that first quarter out of the box, that first reporting period out of the box, and he sort of stayed ahead of me by that amount of money. And it was because he had that network of people that, hey, I've given money to you, you need to give money to me. Or I gave money to this cause, you need to give. So he was able to come out of the box with $100,000. That's kind of the rule of thumb. And I had $100,000 worth of commitments, but I just couldn't get it in the door. I called them really cold calls because I didn't have that fundraising network already in place. I had to build it. But I have it now. And so hopefully, it's something I can use for good causes going forward.
Do you feel like some of the people who have been in politics for a long time, particularly in Georgia, do you find that they're accepting of the idea of having more women in politics?
I think they are now. I think that it's taken people like me and Maria Sheffield and Karen Handel and Linda Shrinko and others that have kind of blazed the trail as an elected, Kathy Cox even on the Democrat side, that have run for things and have shown that they're going to stay in the game in one way, shape, or form. And I think that we've got to, I hope we get to the point where we don't look at people as women candidates, men candidates, black candidates, brown candidates, whatever, that it's just the people with the best ideas. But we're not quite there yet. And I think after this sort of shellacking that Republicans took in this last election, where, yes, 175,000 votes one way or another, Mitt Romney would have been president, but the turnout was big for the president. And I think we need to work harder on getting our message out to women and minorities in the Republican Party, and that's going to be having more women and minorities in positions of leadership.
One thing you had said last time was that that the women in the Republican Party do the work. And I think you were talking a little bit to this when you were talking about volunteering and stuff earlier, but I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, and I think really what you see in whether it's state elections or it's party elections or it's federal elections, that the volunteer base is a lot of times women. And it's whether it's GFRW, which is Georgia Federation of Republican Women, and I'm sure it's true on the Democrat side too. I'm just not as knowledgeable about that. But they do the work, but they don't give much money because they don't have much money to give. And what happens is that the power structure expects them to continue doing the work, even though their candidates don't get get elected. And so I think we need to learn how to not only, and this is what I say when I speak to women's groups, even if it's $50, not only volunteer time, which you need, but write a check for $50. Write a check for $100. It doesn't have to be $2,500. I think sometimes people get overwhelmed when they get that invitation and it says, oh, you can be a sponsor for $2,500. Most people don't have that kind of money, and especially in our district where construction was a big part of how people made their money, and that still hasn't recovered. It's getting better, but it still hasn't recovered. And so I think that what we have to do is learn how to just, even if it's a little bit of money, just to give some money along with your volunteer time.
Do you think that's something that women voters in Georgia are used to?
Giving money? No, they're not. I think, and I was the same way. I mean, I did all kinds of volunteering at my school, at my church. I mean, we are very generous in what we give. My husband and I are very generous in what we give, but we didn't give a lot to political causes because of the business I was in. I felt like being on the radio and being in the media that I didn't, that I shouldn't be giving money to political causes, that I might give them time on the air, I might do something like that, but I didn't think I should give money because I think money's speech and it would imply an endorsement. I didn't want to do that. But I was as guilty as anybody else that I didn't give a lot of money to candidates. I certainly am going to change the way I look at that. I won't have a lot of money to give, but I think I ought to give something.
And in terms of appealing to women, I know that was something that was talked about a lot in the presidential election, and it's been a big topic. What issues do you think that women care about?
Well, I think we did not hit the kitchen table issues the way we should have. If I had been, in the fall election, I would have been talking about the fact gas was 2 times as high, that groceries are 40% higher. I would have been focusing more on those issues that affect women across the board so that you could reach some of those women in the middle. There are about 13% of women that make between $50,000 and $90,000 a year that are part of the electorate, and they go back and forth. They vote Democrat, they vote Republican, they don't necessarily, they're not wedded to any one party. Now, the last 2 times, though, they voted for President Obama, and we know from statistics that if you vote 2 times in a row for a party, you're likely to continue voting for that party. So, it's a concern there. So I think we need to speak a little more to that. To being able to reach out to women on kitchen table issues, if you will. I know that's a Terry McAuliffe, who used to be the DNC chairman. That's a term of his, but I think it works. Issues that everybody has to deal with that aren't partisan. What you pay for groceries and what you pay for gas has nothing to do with what the party says. And I don't think we necessarily back away from the social agenda that we have, but I think that in these times of difficult financial times, that our message on finances is a lot better. All you got to do is look at the numbers at the end of 2012, and there was a bump of 11% in revenue in December for the feds, 10% for the state of Georgia, mainly because people were moving all kinds of things they had to pay taxes on into December because they were afraid taxes were going up in January. And so people will change their behavior based on those kinds of messages. So we need to get better at talking about those kinds of things. But I got to give, the president a lot of credit because he was able to make nobody was talking about contraception, but he was able to make a lot of this about contraception. And I am shocked at the number of women I talked to that really, that was their deciding issue, that they thought that Mitt Romney was going to take the contraceptives away from them, which I think was a ridiculous premise. But we can't say, hey, that's a ridiculous premise. We need to listen, and maybe we need to do a better job of listening. I consider myself to be a feminine woman. I consider myself to be a woman that cares about women's issues and families and that kind of thing. But I realize that a lot of my friends don't look at the Republican Party the way I do. And if you really dig down into the numbers, 2% of people voted for the Libertarian. Okay, and I think in that number, those folks would have been with the Republican had there not been a Libertarian candidate, but they voted for the Libertarian, and that could have swung the election. So we need to look at that and say, what is it about those 2%? It doesn't mean you tailor the party to that 2%, okay, because if you give away your values, it doesn't matter to anything, but how can you work on the message so that you can reach that 2% if we're in a 50-50 world right now for the foreseeable future? Then that 2% is going to make a difference for the foreseeable future. We need a president that wins at 56% like Ronald Reagan did, because when you win at 56 or 58%, it's much easier to get things done than when it's 50-50.
When you were campaigning, what did you hear from the women, particularly in your district? And was it District 9?
9. And I never had a woman say, I'm not going to vote for you because I'm a woman. But women do not necessarily support other women. And it's not a given they're going to support a woman candidate. I had a lot of support from people. I had a couple of people that came up to me, women, and said they thought I was rude on the air and that I'd hung up on somebody sometime, and it's so funny. I'm thinking, like, you remember 8 years ago when I hung up on somebody? You're carrying that around for a long time. But I did have, and I have to be aware too, is that people who don't agree with you aren't necessarily going to come up and tell you. And so there were a lot of different issues that were out there in my campaign, but I felt very positive about it. It was really a very close election, so it's one of those things. But the voters spoke, and I hope Representative Collins does a good job.
Well, do you think, back to the thing, she said she thought you were rude on the air. Do you think that people expect women to behave a certain way in the public light?
I think there is always that concern that men are assertive and women are aggressive, and that there is a different expectation from women and how they're going to act. They also are presented differently in the media. I mean, I don't think anybody asks a man who's running for office or comments about what they wear, how their hair is, what their makeup is, or any of that kind of stuff. But I had those kinds of comments that were made. It wasn't, prolific. It wasn't, a major deal. But there was some of that out there. And there was probably more of that people wouldn't say, because it's not considered to be politically correct to say you wouldn't vote for somebody because of a woman. It's probably not unlike, there are probably people out there that didn't vote for Mitt Romney because he was a Mormon, but they would never really say that out loud, or didn't vote for the president because he was black, but they weren't going to say that out loud. I think when they studied that as far as the race issue with President Obama, I think only about 8% of the people said that him being black was an issue. There's probably a little higher than that. It's probably not much higher than that, but it's not something that's you wouldn't say that out loud to people. So the problem is, President Bush used to have a phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations, in talking about how we look at predominantly black schools versus predominantly white schools. I think there is sort of a soft bigotry against women, against minorities. You're not going to come out and say, against different religions. You're not going to come out and say you're against it, but there is something, it comes into your thought process, and that's just going to take time. I firmly believe that people my children's age are going to have a lot less issues with those kinds of things, and in a way it's because this society's been broken down financially, culturally, in every way. Not to say that it's the end of America. I'm not saying that in any way, shape, or form, but we're sort of leveling the playing field like we did during the Depression. And it's as if people that are from 20 to 30 are sort of starting at the same level and having to build up together. And I'm hopeful because of that. We had some of the greatest growth and the greatest things in our country happen after we sort of started over, after the reset button was hit in the Depression. I'm hoping that that's what's going to happen for my children.
So another thing that we've talked about is your relationship with the Tea Party.
Yep.
And I know you talked last time about doing some speeches for Tea Party groups. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the leaders in the Tea Party, particularly in Georgia.
Well, there's a lot of different Tea Party groups in Georgia, and they have a lot of different agendas. That's the one thing that is the biggest fallacy about the Tea Party, that it's one thing, okay? We did have this one huge event in 2009 where hundreds of thousands of people, some people said it was 100,000 people, some people said it was 2 million people. I know the Capitol Police said that they had closed off the exits coming into DC because too many buses were trying to come in. So it was a huge event, and people came together, and I cannot tell you what a feeling it was to be standing on the steps of the Capitol where people that I admire had stood in years before and got to speak for 3 minutes in front of that group about fiscal responsibility. I mean, it was probably the high point from a professional standpoint of what I've been able to do with the Tea Party. But around here, there are a lot of women that have been very involved in the Georgia Tea Party. Jenny Beth Martin, Julianne Thompson, Debbie Dooley. They have been very involved. Amy Kramer. Some of them have gone on to do some national things. Others have stayed here in the Georgia scene. There's also a lot of other groups around Georgia, and they have very different views about things. And I tend to think we need to be a purist group, that we need to have fiscal issues, Tea Party, taxed enough already, and we need to be focusing on taxes and spending and forget about all the other fringe issues that are out there that we're concerned about. Not that they're not important, but the thing that made Ronald Reagan's presidency so successful was that he had 2 or 3 things that he wasn't going to negotiate on no matter what, and everything else was on the table. And that's why he was able to move his agenda forward. And we haven't really had that since the Reagan presidency. And I know there was some people that say, oh, you've got to get over the ghost of Reagan and all of that kind of stuff. But Reagan was a great manager. Now, he was the last president, though, that didn't have 24-hour news all the time. He was the last president that didn't have blogs and didn't have all of this other kind of stuff. And really the internet, there was some internet, but it wasn't a lot. So he was able to control the message a lot more than other presidents were. So, and there is a nostalgic look back at him. But he had a few issues he didn't compromise on, but also he met with the leaders of the other side. So getting back to your point about the Tea Party, I think we need to do a better job at focusing on what our message is. I don't think it should be its own separate party. I think that it ought to be within the Republican Party. And I think that because if we can't marshal Republicans and Tea Party people together, we're not going to win elections. Okay, because we're not going to get the people that are in the center to the left. We've got to have the middle, the Tea Party, and the Republicans voting together. We're going to lose the majority. And even though we are a very red state, I'm very concerned that Mitt Romney only got 53% in this last election, when the states around us, South Carolina, Alabama, 58, 59%. There is an opportunity. If I'm a Democrat, I'm looking at this and I'm saying there's an opportunity for Democrats in Georgia.
What do you think the perception of the Tea Party is by other people who are either, sort of Atlanta insiders, whether that be politicians or media people?
It's it's amazingly negative because there's been no violence at any Tea Party events. There's been nobody arrested at any Tea Party events. There was an allegation at one of the Washington events. There was some racial slurs thrown at members, but there's no video or audio that has surfaced of that. And in this world of everybody having a phone with a recorder on it, I would think if it happened, something would have surfaced. There were rewards offered up to $150,000 if you could just present something that would prove this. So it's been a fairly peaceful movement. I think it's been exactly what the founders wanted. It was people getting together, using their right to assemble, using their right to organize, and all of that kind of stuff. But there are a lot of people that are afraid of the Tea Party. Within the Republican Party, the consultant class doesn't like the Tea Party because they can't be controlled. And in the Democratic Party, they just hate them. And I don't understand why, because it's no different than I think the labor movement or anything else. It's a movement of people that have said, we've had enough and we want to organize and we want to volunteer. And I think that's a good thing.
Do you think that there are any people who you can kind of see bringing this Tea Party support more in line with the Republican Party in Georgia? Integrating it more, I guess?
Well, I'm going to work hard to do that, number one. But I think Julianne Thompson and Debbie Dooley are the two people that are really working the hardest to bridge that gap between the establishment, the administration, the current administration, and the Tea Party groups that are out there.
Another thing that's been sort of talked about with the Tea Party is that a lot of people say it's predominantly white. Do you think the Tea Party has had trouble attracting minority support?
Yeah, and what I've seen, and maybe in Georgia that's true, when I've gone to national events, it's been kind of a mostly white group. I'm not going to say that, but it's been some blacks and Hispanics. The message again is not a white message. I mean, I think keeping taxes in line and not giving more money to the government than they should. So I can see where that comes from, but nobody is excluded from the movement. And you know what? I think the movement, in fairness, and we're speaking in January of 2013, the movement's trying to find a new direction, just like any conservative movement right now. I mean, right now, conservatives are trying to figure out what they can do without compromising their values to move their message forward. I think, we see it reflected in what's happening in Congress right now, where John Boehner's saying, no more negotiating with the president behind closed doors. We're going to let the House work its will and then see where it's going to go. And it's something, Richard Russell would have loved, using the rules of the House and the Senate to be able to get legislation through. I think would be something that they would look at. But yeah, there is certainly that the mainstream media has been very successful in painting the Tea Party as being a negative thing, and I think we got to just continue to be positive and upbeat and try to get our message out, because I don't see how the message of less taxes, less spending, more efficient government, and more true to the Constitution is a colorblind message. That's not a white message. That's not a black message. It should be an American message.
So do you think maybe it's the social issues that aren't appealing to minorities?
I would like to see the social issues not be a part of the Tea Party, because I think the reason why we had the broad base initially of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents in the Tea Party was because it was a broad-based financial, fiscal message, and focused around the healthcare debate. Really is what kind of, it was the stimulus, as you know, the history of it was the stimulus package being passed is what, had the guy out from CNBC go crazy, Rick Santelli, and then that saying we need a new Tea Party, and then it moved out from that, and it was basically a fiscal movement. In certain parts of Georgia, though, it is very much there's a lot of social issues involved in that too, and I just don't think that's necessary. I think we've got enough movements, Susan B. Anthony lists Georgia Right to Life, that kind of thing, that are furthering that movement. So I just think it ought to be more of a fiscal movement.
So we're almost at the end of the questions that I had for you, but I was wondering, sort of a closing question. What do you think, what do you see happening January 2013, what do you see on the horizon here in Georgia in particular with the new Congress and all of that?
Well, I think in the short term, you got the Georgia legislature, which their number one job is to do the budget. And it looks like this budget this year won't be quite as austere as the last 4 or 5 have been. I think the major battle you're going to have in the Georgia legislature is, is the goal just to go back to the spending of 5 years ago? Or is the goal to make this more streamlined government work with some increases? I mean, you've got a population that's growing, so you can't just keep it flat. But if the goal is just to get back to $23 billion worth of spending, I think that's a mistake. Okay, so that's the battle on the state level, in my view, that we've got to make sure, okay, we've reduced the size of state government dramatically. We've actually reduced employees, but where do we want to spend money? We want to spend money on the university system. We want to spend money on K through 12 in the right places. I mean, it's not, we know just throwing money at it doesn't help, but we got to spend it in the right places. We have this behemoth of Medicaid that is growing faster than education or anything else, and how are we going to deal with that? There's 2 companies in my area of Georgia that have put clinics on campus of their businesses, where they've hired their own doctor, they have their own pharmacy, and they're seeing their patients, seeing the people that work for their company in this clinic, and they've cut their costs by 40%. And we've got to start thinking about things outside the box, or else these healthcare costs are going to just eat us up. They're just going to eat us up. So that's on the state level. On the federal level, we've got to cut spending. We've got to have real cuts in spending. We cannot continue to spend $1 trillion more every single year than what we take in. 2012 was the 3rd highest revenue year that we've ever had as a country. So it's not a case that we're not bringing more revenue in. We are spending too much money. The so-called fiscal cliff did increase taxes for most people. The payroll tax, which I don't, is a whole debate we could get into, has increased for most people. I'll be getting my first paycheck here in a couple of days. I'll see how that's affected. I'm definitely not a top 1%er, so it's going to be something there. And then we've got to offer some spending cuts, and everything ought to be on the table. And I think that if we do not deal with Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and I don't call them entitlements because you paid into them, I paid into them. Every paycheck I've made since I was 16 years old has had a portion taken out for FICA for Social Security and Medicare. So it's not an entitlement program, but it is something that we've got to figure out what we're going to do for people like me that are in their 50s, what we're going to do for people that are in their late 30s to 50s, and what we're going to do for the people that are under 30, in their 30s and younger, and what to expect, because people that are in their 30s can plan for their future. If you change the rules on them, they can say, okay, these are the new rules and this is how we're going to fix it. People in their 40s can still do that, but you got people that are in their 50s and 60s, it's pretty hard for them to change the game. We've got to figure out what we're going to do. We can't be afraid to make that case, and that's what's happened so far. And this last deal just kicked the can down the road. It's more spending, it's higher taxes and more spending. I don't know how we got that, but it seems like it's opposite. So I'm going to do everything I can in the future. I'm going to continue. I'm back on the air, and I'm going to continue to be talking the talk. I'm going to continue to be putting the conservative message out there with a smile on my face, because I think that's what we have to do. And I'm going to keep talking to women and minorities about why conservatism is a better way to go. And but I'm going to be a happy warrior about it, because you're not going to win every battle. If there's one thing this election taught me, is you're not going to win every battle, but you still have to have a pity party for about 48 hours and then dust yourself off and get going again.
Well, thank you. It was good talking with you.
Thank you.